for not talking, Bob? Is that the best?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it is.
so.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll be muted too.
All right. Welcome everybody to our, how do you say, the after election, our November edition of the Labor Forum. One of the most exciting ventures that we have coming from the University of Illinois Labor Education Program, where we sit and we tackle issues that affect everyday working people and the types of crises that we continue to face as 2020 comes to an end, and we look forward to 2021 and the kind of ways in which labor can be at the center of a lot of the things that we want to make better about our society. And so, of course, today is the best day to do a post-election labor analysis. And so this one is titled "Labor at the Battle," the ballot box, a critical look at battleground states. And so today we're going to be talking a lot about how labor can be at the forefront of a lot of the issues now that not only that how the election ended, but how did labor participate in the election? What was our status in various battleground states? And what do we see as a path forward for strengthening the labor movement, the union movement, and also organizing non-union workers as well? And so that's what we're going to be getting into today. I'm joined by three amazing panelists. My name is Augustus Wood. I'm a postdoc at the University of Illinois in labor education, alongside my awesome colleague, Stephanie Furtado, who I'll let introduce herself later on. But first, I wanted to introduce our guest panelists, but definitely want to give a shout out to Dr. Robert Bruno, who is the Director of Labor Education Program, who has been instrumental in helping us get this webinar, podcast, and political education tool off the ground so that we continue to do this every month around labor. So now I want to introduce our three panelists who we're just so grateful to have today to talk about these issues. First, I want to start with Paul Clark, who is a professor and director who is professor and director of the School of Labor and Employment Relations at Penn State University. He has over 40 years of experience as a union member, labor educator, union consultant, and university professor. His research is focused on employment relations in the U.S. healthcare, steel, and coal industries, union structure, government and administration, union member commitment and participation, new union member orientation and socialization, and the globalization of labor markets. His work has appeared in the leading scholarly journals in industrial and labor relations, applied psychology, and international labor issues. He is the author of 3 books, including Building More Effective Unions, first published by Cornell ILR Press in 2001, second edition 2009, and the editor of 3 additional edited books. He has also worked on training programs and research projects for over 50 national unions and many local and regional unions. So Paul, thank you for joining us today. We're also joined by Roland Zullo, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is an associate research scientist at the School of Social Work at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Prior to the COVID-19 shutdown, Roland directed the Center for Labor and Community Studies at the University of Michigan, Dearborn. Roland advocates for economic and political democracy and studies how non-market institutions contribute to the formation of sustainable economies, defined as exchange systems that are equitable, politically stable, and environmentally responsible. He is a former member of the Steelworkers and Wisconsin Federation of Teachers. Roland earned his PhD at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. So Roland, thank you for joining us as well. And we are finally also joined by David Luciano, who was born in New York in a very strong union family. He started volunteering for campaigns at age 10 and discovered what he wanted to do with the rest of his life, be a professional political operative. DJ, as he's known, works closely with another managing partner, Robert Frost, on political engagements, and combined, both David and Mr. Frost have worked on or consulted with over 450 campaigns around the country. That's a combined 64 years of campaign experience, ranging from local, state, and federal campaigns, with an increasing emphasis on ballot initiatives. In addition to his strategic work, DJ specifically handles all the field operations for Invictus Consultants LLP. In 2016, DJ successfully ran the statewide ballot initiative to help protect collective bargaining for teachers in the state of Georgia. Later that year, he was called to head up the statewide ground operations for the Senate race in Alabama for Doug Jones. And DJ still lives in Akron and continues his work as a consultant for various campaigns and has been nationally recognized as a top campaign consultant and field operator. So, David, thank you for joining us. And I'll pass it on now to Stephanie to get us going.
Thank you. Thank you so much for Gus. And thank you to our panelists. I'm really, really excited about the group that we have here today for this critical conversation. Before I start in with questions, I wanted to see if I know the director of our program, Bob Bruno, is on the call. Bob, do you have any reflection about this last week that you wanted to say before we get into this conversation?
Well, first of all, let me thank all of our guests. It's an honor really to have Paul and Roland and DJ join us at this opportune time, just a day after the presidential election is called. There are still some Senate seats still to be determined. And of course, central to all the work that we all do is the role of organized labor as a political agent. And I have been reflecting a great deal on where labor has been, not just in this election, but where they were 4 years ago, where they've been over the past decades. And as Gus, I think, properly contextualized it, the role of organized labor as a galvanizing collective body to speak to the interest of working people is critical to democracy. There just is no other institution that can bring the interest and the concerns of working people into the political process. So I can't think of any more important conversation. And while I've had the pleasure of teaching the subject of American politics and unions for many, many years, I see this as a great opportunity for me to be a student and to listen to what our guests have to say. And occasionally, Steph, if I have a really good question and I want to shake things up, I'll just throw that into the mix, okay? Otherwise, I'm gonna be quiet and listen. But thank you all for being part of the Labor Education Program Forum.
All right, so the first question we have, and I mean, for those watching on Facebook and for our three panelists, this last week has been about 6 months long. I have to admit, I've spent I feel like I know more about the counties in Arizona and Nevada and Georgia and Pennsylvania than I've ever wanted to know, and it's been just sort of a roller coaster. So I guess the first question I have is for each of you, for the respective states that you're in, or you could also talk nationally. How do you think labor engaged in this election? How was labor involved in this election in the states that you're in? And you know what? Why don't we go with the order that the states were called? So I believe Ohio was called first. So why don't we start with Ohio?
Yeah. So Stephanie, congratulations on saying Nevada correctly. It is Nevada. No other way to say it. I'm actually in Nevada right now. But Ohio actually is a little bit different than what the national labor household vote total ended up being. Much like 2016, Donald Trump actually won union households here in Ohio. So, I think labor's got a hard conversation to start having with itself, and the Democratic Party has a hard conversation pretty soon to start having as well, and why they're losing union households in the state of Ohio. Ohio, I hate to be a spoiler here. It's not a swing state anymore. I think it's a red state, and I've been saying that for a while now, much to the chagrin of my Democratic friends. But I think we've got a hard task ahead of us in Ohio. But I also think it's nationally too. I think we're going to start seeing some of those trend lines that are happening in Ohio. They're going to start happening in other more industrial states coming up, and labor and the Democratic Party better be ready for that, because I don't think they are yet, and I don't think they're seeing this iceberg coming yet.
You know, and as somebody who's from Ohio, who grew up in Ohio, whose entire family still lives in Ohio, I have to agree with you about that. Ohio just, I mean, it's like people are like act as if it's still a swing state, and it I don't know. Why don't we go to Michigan next? Because I believe they were the next state that was called. If Ohio was an early, went to the red state, Michigan was one of those battleground states that went relatively early to Biden's column.
Yeah, so I think it's useful to think about 2020 in relation to what happened in 2016. And here in Michigan, I'd say within labor, there's sort of two main factors. One is sort of Trump's brand of economic populism, which I consider sort of a form of neo-mercantilism, which I think the Democrats have to begin to think about. They've at least seemed somewhat tone deaf to things like plant closures. And I know this is an issue in Ohio, it's an issue in the Midwest generally, but the pain from capital flight and plant closures is something that we know all too well here in Michigan. And, I think in 2016, Trump appeared as someone who was going to do something about it finally. And, we've had 4 years and there hasn't been much progress at all there. So I think that's one of the changes. The other major change here is that for, I think, many residents, labor and union and non-union, there was this creeping sense of fascism that we had to beat back. And we're watching it now, right, with the challenges to the election now. It's an inability to accept sort of a democratic outcome, and I think that led to a substantial increase in turnout. So turnout in Michigan was about 63% in 2016. It jumped to I wrote it down here 68.5% this time around, and certainly labor had some role in that, and we can go into more detail about that. But I would say that the bigger factor was just the fear of another 4 years of Trump. So let me leave it there, and we can talk more in detail about any of that.
All right, so let's hear our opening comments from Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, just got called yesterday. Gus and I actually do a local radio show on labor issues together on the weekends, and it was while I was going into our show that it was called. So could you just talk a little bit about what's going on in Pennsylvania with labor in this election?
Pennsylvania was a critical state, but I don't think that was a surprise to anybody. We've been gearing up here for this for the last 4 years. As of yesterday, the state was called. Biden is up today by about 43,000 votes. Trump won last year by about 68,000 votes. So that's about 100,000 vote swing. And I think in terms of labor's role, labor can take some credit for having what we might want to call a marginal impact in a marginal race. You know, we're very much a state divided between rural and urban, suburban, and the membership of unions in this state reflects that same division. But Pennsylvania unions, I think, had a fairly significant impact in the urban areas, and particularly in Philadelphia and the suburbs. And that's really where the election was decided. I don't have statistics about the union vote yet. I believe that Obama won about 65% of the union vote, or Clinton won, I'm sorry, Obama won 65% of the union vote in 2012. It was down to about 55% for Clinton in 2016. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's around the 50% mark this time. We'll have to see. But, you know, the labor movement didn't fold its tent and go away. It worked very hard in the state. And as I say, I think that work had an impact. I think there's a certain discouragement in the labor movement about the fact that the union vote probably is about in the 50% range. And in more conservative unions like building trades, you know, it may well be south of there. But in the service sector unions, the education unions, it was significantly higher. So every vote, every union vote really counted, and labor fought hard for that. But going forward, I do agree that labor, there's a certain reckoning coming that certainly one would hope that the future is not a labor movement trying to keep, 51% of its members supporting the candidate that unions support. But I got to tell you, in the rural areas, it's going to be an enormously difficult task. It's really going to take a cultural change for things to get a lot different. So we'll have to see. I don't know that anybody has a magic bullet to make that cultural shift come around. But I do remember how discouraged people in the labor movement were when Ronald Reagan was elected, and the percentage of Reagan, Democrats that supported him. We saw significant progress down through the presidential elections that followed, up to a point where Obama won 65% of the labor movement. So we've been down this road before. It's taken time, but we've made progress. I think that's the optimistic message. Hopefully we can make that happen again.
Thank you so much for that, Paul. And I think all three of you hit on something that's really critical to kind of something I've been kind of toying with a while, is that this issue of what is the current status of the labor movement in relation to fighting for the interests of the rank and file workers on the ground. And I think, Roland, you really hit on something really critical in relation to the economic mercantilism and the issues of the loss of productive space with paying livable wage jobs just leaving and not being replaced. And that's something that we've often talked about, the deindustrialization of the United States urban spaces. But when you look at parts of Michigan, Ohio, Atlanta, Wisconsin, all these places where there are viable factories that are completely wiped out and nothing's replaced them, and yet you have the labor movement not speaking directly to those particular demands, then you come into the contradiction that I think affected what David's getting at in relation to Ohio, and that there seems to be kind of a ceiling in relation to how much of the voice of the workers are getting out now. So I want to kind of turn back to David and ask, since you're out there, and as you mentioned, Ohio's no longer a swing state. It's no longer a battleground state. It is red now. What have you heard in relation to the work you do from workers about their biggest issues with why they are voting more so for the Republican side? What are they talking about? What are their disillusionments, or what are their issues that they keep finding that they are not being answered? Is it similar to what Roland's talking about in Michigan, that in relation to the economic mercantilism? What do you think, David?
I think there's a lot of that going on, but I also think too that it's a layover from some of the national issues that the Democratic Party tends to grab. I call them trap issues. They're just issues that aren't really going to affect the worker. They don't really have any chance of getting anywhere. I mean, it would be, you could have something as simple as, somebody just saying, there needs to be, going to a union member and telling them, talking to, a 57-year-old, male union voter about, trans bathrooms, for example. They don't care about that. They want their paycheck. They want a paycheck. They want dignity of work. And I think that the Democratic Party sometimes is culpable to that from the labor's decrease in vote for the Democratic candidates. So I think that there's a layer of, the fact that factories are closing. In Akron, Ohio, we just had we've got one that's closing relatively soon. That was a blow to us. And it doesn't, there's, when a worker that's been there for 20 years gets a text message the night before to say, hey, come and unbolt the machine so we can ship it to Mexico and you get to load it in the box. I mean, that's a body blow to somebody that has been making a living off of, and their family has been, and maybe even their dad had worked at the factory as well, or their mom. And so I think there's a level of that, not replacing the work, obviously. But I also think that there's a level of the Democratic Party and union leadership not really speaking to the men and women in the rank and file. And some of those have to do with, those trap culture issues, and I think that is a significant problem. And that's kind of the Titanic iceberg that I was referring to earlier when we started. And so that's at least my take from them. I mean, when you talk to a union member that's pro-Trump or pro-Republican, and you tell them, hey, do you want to vote for X, Y, or Z, and they say Democrat or Republican, and then you tell them Democrat and they go, I think that's an issue, and it's not something that the union leadership, I think, has caught on to how to fix that. And part of that is, like I said, I think it's both them and the Democratic parties. I think they both have work to do on that front.
Can I actually, Stephanie, Gus, would you mind if I jumped in real quick?
Fine.
And the reason I'm doing this, I recall that my esteemed colleague, Paul Clark, who I think who's always been a kind of a guide and a mentor to my work. Paul, you wrote some pretty important stuff in the 1990s that addressed the way that cultural issues, Dave's calling them trap issues, perhaps, the way those really began to peel at and challenge organized labor's capacity to mobilize their members, where they were confronted with issues that were not essentially economic issues, maybe, as Dave said, specific to the work, but culture was changing, society was changing, and they were being challenged by some of these other issues. So I'd love to hear you comment, because I know you've written on this, and Roland, certainly feel free. Thanks, folks.
Well, and Bob, real quick before they answer, I wanted to mention that in the comments, Scott Marshall, who is with the steelworkers, has sort of brought this up as well. He said, I don't think we can overlook the rising tide of labor and the people's movements, Black Lives Matter, women's movements, immigrants' rights movement, and others. He's seeing it as a positive thing that's energizing people he says he hasn't seen anything like this since the rise of the CIO, and with the USW that is mobilizing members, and they're more active than he's seen in a long time. But to sort of dovetail on what you asked, I mean, yes, we are also in a moment of profound cultural change, I would argue, in this country. So, and that definitely is shaping labor's response, I think, to the Democratic Party. So just to sort of echo what Scott said to add to your question. Why don't we start with Paul?
Well, you know, it's interesting because the work that Bob is talking about goes back into the late 1980s, 1990s, when we were sort of sitting around talking about similar issues. The frustration of union members being peeled off on cultural issues. The frustration that, you know, the labor movement just could not make its members see that the Democratic pro-union candidates were the people that, in the labor movement's view, were working in the best interests of working people. Yet people were discounting economic issues and other issues and voting on guns. Back then was the rise of the moral majority and fundamentalist Christian involvement in politics, and that was peeling members away. And I hate to say it, but you know, I think we've even lost ground in terms of those cultural issues. I mean, I don't know if you'd call it a movement, but there is a unified sort of community of conservative rural Americans. And there's a culture to that part of our country. And you know, you can look at things as superficially as pickup trucks and country music. But when you examine and try to study and analyze culture, these kind of things are critically important. And in this last election, there clearly were elements that signaled to me that this culture has really come together in a stronger and bigger way in the past. Trump's rallies, as silly as they may seem to some of us, and as unimportant as simple ego gratification exercises on the part of Trump, you know, I think are part of this movement, and they draw hundreds of thousands of people over time, and involvement in those tie people into this culture. In the same way that, you know, my wife thinks yard signs, and there's a whole discussion in politics about that. My wife thinks they're silly, but I spent a lot of time driving around rural Pennsylvania, and you know, you don't have to do polls. You can tell where rural Pennsylvania is by the yard signs, and not just the 1 yard sign, the 14 Trump signs that somebody has in their yard. It tells you the intensity and the scope of this. So I think we've lost ground on cultural issues, similar to what David says. Some of these issues that are significant to more urban union members just don't fly with rural union members. So just like we have a national divide, we have a divide in the labor movement. We have conservative building trades unions whose members are far south of 50% in terms of this election supporting Biden. And we have urban service and public sector unions where the members are voting at 70 or 80%. Now, how you bridge that divide, it's as difficult as the issue of how do we bridge this divide as a country. That's the real challenge of the labor movement going forward.
Yeah, let me try to jump in and contribute to what was said. You know, the message matters that goes out, and the communication of that message and how effective that communication is matters. I think one of the considerations that perhaps the Democratic Party might want to consider one of the, okay, anyway, perhaps a reconsideration for the Democratic Party is the heavy reliance on identity politics as a strategy to cull votes. And the identity politics along race, gender, sexual orientation, and so forth. That might be that a heavy emphasis on that might not appeal to rural voters. If you look at the strength and the attraction of the Bernie Sanders campaign, which was more class oriented, I think that perhaps provides a lesson for the Democratic Party should they, ever venture to dare go there. But they don't play the class identity very well, and I think that's part of the Democratic Party message. Now, in terms of the message getting to people, I think union tactics have at least. I've tested some of these forms of communication between leaders and members, and the more distant you get, the more it becomes a commercialized message that comes in a flyer through the mail to the household, the less effective it is. If a union member doesn't understand the difference between two candidates, they're more likely to make a choice based upon some of the cultural issues that Paul mentioned. So if they don't see a difference along economics, then they'll vote for the politician that supports them, that's going to help them protect their gun ownership. I mean, this is the way, those single issue cultural topics can be very attractive to folks that don't have a lot of information. And much of the information that I think is going out from unions to their members tends to be overly commercialized. We've lost, the face-to-face methods, which we know are more effective. The more personalized and face-to-face the messages are, and the more it comes with some valuable information, and not just these rather vacuous commercialized flyers that say very little, and they're designed to impress but not really inform. So labor spends money on that, and that those resources could be spent, in my judgment, toward a more effective communication model. So you have, so those are the points. I hope that added a little bit to what Paul and David had said.
No, it definitely does, because what it ties directly to is the biggest issue. I think all you were pointing at in relation to, and I think David said it earlier, this difficult conversation that the Democratic Party has yet to have. And Paul kind of hit on this as well, is that when you look at what happened in the 1980s, there was a move from both parties, particularly the Democratic Party, to move away from the idea of the working class. There was an anti-working class move away, a pivot away from anything related to class struggle, particularly from blue collar laborers. There was this move away from it. And so, of course, how do you replace that dedication to looking at the material realities of the people to actually do something about it so that the people can hold you accountable? You replace it with superficial understandings of identity instead of actually doing something about legitimate diversity, meaning changing the social realities of all of the people who are oppressed in different ways. But again, you all just said it. To do that, the Democratic Party would have to stop showing those commercialized pieces that only hint at, you're one of us, so vote for us. And they will actually have to dig in and do an analysis and research of the things that they would have to deliver, meaning be held accountable for when they are elected. And so that type of accountability issue is the thing the Democratic Party, I believe, has moved away from, to allow that labor to be so split and to be so divided on the issues that you all are calling cultural, but I call them more so social. in that there is an issue related to the way that the political parties try to gather their people or try to mobilize, or a better term, mobilize the vote. And so you all are hitting on the exact same thing that we just have to have more hardcore conversations about. And it's about listening to the rank and file workers and actually caring about the conditions to fix them. That's the big thing we have to deal with. And so this ties directly into another question then, is that class. Let's dig into class a bit. In each of your three areas, how does class play out in relation to how labor votes for the whichever party? Because some of the exit polling is coming out and saying that some of the that in some spaces, people who are in the professionalized group, some of the teachers, et cetera, who were unionized, were voting more so on the side of Trump than for Biden. Versus in some spaces, like somebody mentioned, the blue collar in urban spaces votes more for Biden, you know. And so yeah, so did any of you notice any class elements or class analysis in the voting or in the campaigning leading up to this election?
I'll be happy to jump in here. One of the changes here in Michigan this time around was we did have a coalition of union affiliated groups. So it was spearheaded by Rock, Michigan. Rock is a restaurant opportunity center for those who, but also joined with the APRI constituency group, LACLA, and CLU. And what they did something that was a little bit different from what most unions do, is they focused on trying to mobilize and encourage voting participation among what they call low propensity voters. When you study vote turnout, you know that there's, that aside from age, perhaps the strongest predictor of turnout is SES. And what these guys did was they went to 11, I believe it was 11 urban areas in Michigan, and they sought communities and persons that would probably not vote without some encouragement, and they helped them vote. And what harmed their ability to pull this off was obviously COVID, because COVID put some restrictions on being able to talk face to face with folks. But on the other hand, what helped them was the fact that we had the liberalization of early voting here in Michigan. So that allowed, a lot of these folks are working class persons that might have more than one job, and voting is fairly low in priority for them compared to all the other things they have to worry about. But when you have a whole month to get a ballot in and to be able to sit down at your kitchen table and fill it out and mail it in, which makes it a lot easier, that helped encourage turnout among those low propensity voters. Now we have, I'm working with this group, so I haven't, it's just too soon, but we do have a study taking place where we want to look at the effectiveness of this. But that did take place, and we're hoping to see some positive effect from those efforts.
Great. Do either one of our other panelists want to tackle that question?
Yeah, I'll just jump in real quick and say that there was a project several years ago that I was on in Iowa, and we were working with teachers, nurses, union working men and women. And one of the things that we did a lot is get them together. This is, of course, pre-COVID, when you could do those kind of things. And we got them together and we started having conversations over everything from family leave to childcare affordability to pay to everything in between. And one of the things that was pretty remarkable when I was in there just observing it was the lack of trust sometimes in the from the workers with the union leadership. And I think Roland hit it earlier when he said the commercialization of them and put them on the mailers. I think long are the days gone of the AFL logo or the steelworker logo being there and that being enough. And COVID unfortunately made that a little bit worse for labor as well. But there was a real sense in the room, and we were doing probably 4 or 5 a week at various times. And these were people that were concerned about X, Y, or Z issues, and then we would lump them all in a room, and we'd start talking to them about, how can we get you out to vote? How can we get your friends out to vote? And and does the leadership, represent what you're feeling and what you're seeing on the ground? And there was a real gap between that, and that's one of the things that I think again that the labor should be ready to tackle, or at least starting on it pretty soon, with that gap of leadership to those members. It's going to be a fight, I think.
Paul, what do you think? How did class play into this issue? How do you see that playing in Pennsylvania?
Well, let me answer it this way. I've been around longer than some folks. I do remember the Reagan years, and one of the issues there during that time period with Reagan Democrats is we really couldn't convince union members that fully convince them that the economy was rigged intentionally against them. So here we are in the 2010s and into the 2020s. If you had told me then, if you could get American workers to embrace the idea that the system is rigged, the economic system is rigged against them, I'd say we're where we want to be. And then if you had told me that they would use that as a rationale to support a multi-millionaire billionaire who is part of the class that has rigged the system, I would say that you're way off base. So what does that say? Well, when I hear union members or any working people saying the system is rigged against us, and I'm supporting Donald Trump, what I hear them saying is cultural and social issues are more important to me, that I will accept that whether I truly believe it or not. I can't hold both points of view at the same time. I agree with Trump on social and cultural issues, and I'm just gonna, I don't know, either pretend to go along with the economic part of it, or I truly believe it. So I think it gets us back to how powerful these social and cultural issues are, and how we have to overcome them before we can, before we can really get workers to make economic issues, class issues, the things that really motivate them.
No, Paul, I think that's a really important point. One of my favorite questions to ask after the 2016 election when I did labor education and I asked this of all sorts of different kind of unions, and I said, hey, for those of you who voted for Trump or know people that voted for Trump and that are union members, why? And they every time came back with guns. That was always the answer. And it almost kind of didn't matter which union I was at. That was the answer, guns. That's what they said. And it was very interesting to me that issue sort of percolated above, like you said, economic self-interest in a real serious way. So we are having a real strong conversation in the comments on Facebook. And there's been a lot of questions about, is it a matter of communication with unions, education with unions, in terms of educating members on issues and things like that. And then there's been a lot of conversation about just sort of that, how issues, and by this I mean labor issues, need to drive, right, some of how we're doing this. But then there was another interesting question that was, so do you think that they're going to repeal Taft-Hartley, which is, a big question. So I want to pivot us a little bit, and I want to hear from the three of you. Okay, so if everything holds and Biden, becomes our next president, what do you make of his labor agenda, and what do you think is possible for labor under a Biden presidency, given that, depending on what happens in Georgia, which is where Gus is from, he might have a Senate that is, from the other party. So what do you think? Let's pivot a little bit away from it, analyzing the election, to what are labor's prospects under a Biden presidency? That's a big question.
Guess I'll jump in. No, I don't think Taft-Hartley will get repealed because of the effectiveness of the secondary boycotts. So I don't think that's on the table. If there could potentially be enough support for repealing 14B, Section 14B on the right to work issue, possibly. But even that, I think, has a pretty slim chance, especially if you'd have to have enough senators to go along, and I don't think that's going to be in the cards in the next few years. What labor can hope for, though, are more friendly appointments to the NLRB, which could matter a great deal. We've had some incredibly hostile appointments under Trump, and that I would think would be probably one of the main benefits labor can expect under a Biden presidency, and perhaps a stronger enforcement of labor and employment law.
Yeah, I agree. I think you're right on the head there, Roland, with that. I don't really know how much can get done. It's going to be a benefit outside of those two things that Roland already spoke about, but it'll be helped along because President-elect Biden at least has longstanding relationships in the Senate. And so I think any movement in there will be helped a lot by those, by his just natural ability to bring people together. So I think there's some hope for some movement, but I will say they better do something, and because if they don't deliver, it's going to be it's going to be tough. And so they need to make sure that they are doing something, and a fight without a win sometimes is okay. And so the men and women in the labor movement should and hope to see the Biden administration in the fight for them. And even if they die on the Hill, that's okay. But if they see them slow step into things and not really doing it, and we'll get to it, or we don't have enough political juice to get to it right now, I think they're going to be in for a rude awakening. And so I would say, even if it's not winnable, sometimes it's more beneficial, at least from a electoral and campaign standpoint, to say, hey, let's take this and let's at least galvanize our support. Let's get these union households pushing back in our direction overwhelmingly, especially in states like Ohio. So I would say that as long as they're active in doing something, I think that will be a good thing. But outside of those two things that Roland had already mentioned of getting done, I don't know how much will get done, but hopefully there's a flurry of activity.
Yeah, and Paul, I'll take it to you. And in the comments, one of the specific things folks asked about was Charles mentioned that Biden's commitment to having a cabinet level working group to support collective bargaining. And then, one of the things he's maybe talked about more than anything is his plan for actual robust public infrastructure plan. So maybe just adding some of those specifics in. What do you think we're going to see? Several people have said, what should we look for from a Biden? This comment has come up several times in the comments. What should we look for from a Biden presidency in the first 100 days in terms of labor?
Well, it's pretty clear that much of the damage that President Trump did, he did with executive orders, and Biden's going to be able to issue executive orders as well. Most recently, we've seen some real attacks on federal workers that I think can be pretty readily turned around. But that's not an issue that's going to generate tremendous support in the labor movement. But it does have an impact. There are other things that he can do that again are going to have a real impact, but I don't think are the big ticket issues. Safety and health. The OSHA administration has really just gone AWOL under Trump, and that's something that Biden can do, and hopefully get enough support in the Senate to increase budgets and get them involved in terms of COVID. But the infrastructure initiative that you mentioned, I think that could have a very significant impact. Who is most impacted when you start spending hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure? It's going to be building trades unions, which puts the labor movement and the Democrats in a position in the next election to pull back some of that support. If you're building bridges and roads and putting lots of construction workers to work, that's going to have an impact. Jobs in other ways that the Biden administration can show that it's putting an emphasis on creating jobs. And as far as David's comment, I do agree. I don't think there's a great opportunity here for the pro legislation, that is the collective bargaining legislation, or bringing back EFCA from the dead, because even if you could get a few moderate Republican senators to vote for it, you're probably going to lose some moderate Democrats. But making the fight, raising those issues and communicating to the labor movement that the Democratic Party really stands for these things, supports these things, and going to fight for them, that could be pretty significant when you come around to the 2024 election, in terms of really getting the labor movement and all sections of the labor movement, from building trades, service unions, education unions, industrial unions behind you. That could make a big difference.
I'd like to just add one more thought here. I think the trajectory in terms of the president being a spokesperson and advocate for unions is encouraging. So, under Bill Clinton, he was notorious for saying very little about the value and of unions. Under Barack Obama, we had some verbal support, and I think under Biden, we have someone who's unafraid to say, we need stronger unions. This is something that's good for the economy. It's good for our society, and I think we have. And it's hard to put a value on that, but when you have the president of the United States encouraging unionism, I think that's in general a good thing for the labor movement.
Paul, I just wanted to say on your comment about the executive orders, I'm going to go ahead and get out on a limb here and say in about 73 days, Republicans are going to be opposed to executive orders. So that'll be interesting to see the tapes of all of them in favor of all of those things. But so just wanted to throw that out there that they're going to probably be against those real soon. So.
And just to kind of sum up what all three of you have said, that I think is really the point we want to get across when we put together this forum, is that, you know, there's a dialectical relationship headed with how we as the working class or the workers, the unions, have to demand what we want so that it becomes something that Biden is speaking about, that the senators are fighting for. And just like I think I forgot who it was, that Dave or Paul said it, that if we don't see these fights as being a struggle, something that Biden is talking about, something the senators are talking about, then what ends up happening is you have the disillusioned voters who either don't vote anymore or they vote another, they vote for the opposing party. And so I think that that's a historical issue. I know that during this particular race, one of the biggest issues, of course, was the African-American working class vote, because again, that was a big thing that a lot of people talked about, was that if we've had so many histories now going beyond Barack Obama, where the African-American struggles, particularly after the recessions of 2008, have not been dealt with on a substantial level. So therefore, why should the African-American working class vote for Joe Biden? And it became this rallying call that if you don't defeat Donald Trump and fascism, then it's going to accelerate and even deepening oppression of the African-American working classes. And that was kind of the rallying vote for the neighborhoods, but it still left off what exactly all three of you said, is that if we don't see you fighting for the things that matter to us, then we're going to take that as you are not in favor of our interests. And so I think you all hit on a very important point there, is that we have to demand that those be central, and we have to call upon leadership, particularly at the international level of unions, to challenge Biden, to challenge senators, to challenge the Congress on everything that we need. And so I'm glad that you all said those things, because those are things that we want to get across. But I also wanted to ask you all about this particular issue, about the future. One of the biggest problems that I was a former union president myself, and I was on executive boards of labor councils. And our biggest issue was trying to get labor education put back in the schools and actually talk about growing labor youth. You know, the idea that there was a pride in learning trades and learning what the working class was and learning the history of labor, and not just having to know the Common Core standards of who Samuel Gompers is, and that's it. Like, there was actual intensity about building labor as a solid foundation to build a life in the United States. And so, do you think that there's opportunity, and I know Georgia plays a long part in this, but also too, based on your expertise in all three of your levels, what do local labor leaderships have to do from your standpoint to push for a more robust labor education under Joe Biden presidency, especially with what you all just mentioned? Having those appointments in the NLRB are going to be huge. And also the idea of pushing for funding of educational programs for labor at state levels can also be huge. So again, what kind of moves via communication, via political lobbying, however you want to call it, or via organizing when we can go door to door, what are some strategies that local labor leadership can do to kind of start rebuilding labor from the ground up through the education system? What do you all think?
Well, Gus, I have a sort of theory that some might think is off the wall here. But, you know, people who have supported Donald Trump, whether they believe it or not, as I mentioned earlier, have been talking about how rigged the system is and how working people are getting screwed. And then Donald Trump was able to come along and, I don't know, somehow throw magic dust up and get people to believe that he's the one that can solve that problem. But, you know, when Donald Trump goes away, I think there's going to be a big void, because I don't think other Republicans are they don't have that magic dust. And if people, if this belief that and understanding that the system really is rigged, there's going to be a void to fill. And that's why I think the next 4 years are really a critical time for putting the labor movement forward as the answer to that problem. And that gets back to your labor education question. I mean, obviously, I've done labor education my whole life. I believe it's terribly important. I think it's going to be even more critically important in the future, but sort of in a larger general sense. We have to educate society about the potential role that labor can play in addressing income inequality and an economy that is not set up to work for people. This is getting in people's consciousness that we have these problems, but people don't see the labor movement as the answer. So if you start with labor education in the schools, that's helpful in terms of the generation coming forward. If you can get labor education with union members, that gets more labor union members on board about it. If you can get those ideas out into the general public consciousness, through op-eds, through public scholarship and public education, then you have a chance of turning this thing around so that when people do say the system is rigged, then the answer they think about is the labor movement.
Yeah, and I would just say that I think membership education is a huge part of that, Gus. I think that is where the focus should be. I think they have to really connect with their members on what is truly important and why unions are even relevant for them. Because there are a lot of people that they might be in a union, but they don't feel, like I said before, that they're, that it really has any impact on their day-to-day life. And so I think that's going to be an important part of it. The easier task, practically anyways, that labor unions could do, much harder in reality, I understand, is to start to activate and recruit younger union members into their leadership. And I think that is going to be something that part of the conversation that labor is not ready for yet, that I spoke about earlier, is in turn on that. It's part of that. And I think we need to understand that is going to have to happen. And we can't just, it can't just be a wait around until, this local president, passes away and then, somebody that's 3 years younger than him gets it. Or, you need to give somebody in that labor movement, the 22-year-old, the 25-year-old, the single mom, whoever that is in that movement, in the labor movement, they need to feel like they're a part of it. And, just going to a meeting or just getting a letter every once in a while is not getting them to buy in enough. So I think union membership education is going to be important, but I also think that union leadership needs to start really being driven from the ground up, and in the terms of younger voters and younger union members as well.
I think 2 points. First, in terms of general labor strategy, the union movement does fairly well when it gets behind and supports popular progressive movements. So if you study what happened, if you study labor's role with the civil rights movement from the 20th century, I mean, you see that there were some unions that were part of the problem, and a lot of unions that just were kind of neutral and didn't do much at all. And then there were a few very progressive unions that were trying to make it go forward. And the labor movement generally has to be sensitive to pressing issues and problems. And so for instance, we have obvious challenges with the environment and with global warming right now, and I don't think the labor movement should sit that out. I don't think they should. I think they should get behind those activists and in some way support them with the to the extent they can, and still maintain good relations with their members. Right. This is always the challenge. Right. So the coal miners and global warming and so forth. I mean, you have those kinds of challenges, but to the extent that the labor movement can get behind and back these progressive efforts in the field, I think that helps. It helps certainly solidify labor historically as part of the progressive arm of society, that big element that could be part of the problem solving that Paul had mentioned. The other issue I would say in terms of the labor movement is I think we're in an era when we need many, many, many leaders. We don't need, sort of the administrative model of unions is less effective when the fights become decentralized and less institutionalized. So when we're engaged in work stoppages, for example, that are not sanctioned by the union, or work stoppages among workers that don't have a union, like many of those teachers when they so what I would encourage the labor movement, and I'm glad we have some very engaged labor educators here. I would encourage that the labor movement considers supporting more of a Freirean-based education model for developing leadership. That instead of having students come in and learning about history and law and so on and so forth, you give them real activist roles, and the intent is to build activists. The intent is to create, again, many activists, as opposed to imparting skills, which is important, but you want to have a slightly different education model. And so those are the two additions I would make to that point.
Thanks. Those are just, as a labor educator, those answers were really powerful. So thank you for all of those. I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction. We've mostly focused on the presidency, and that makes a lot of sense because, that is the top of the ticket and shapes a lot of our national policy. But besides the presidency, are there any particular races or particular ballot measures that either passed or didn't pass, or were elected, or went towards a labor candidate or not a labor candidate, either in your states or nationally, that you really think are important, are something that labor should be paying attention to, that really matter, that either showed labor's power or the lack of labor's power, right? Either way. But are there other issues, either issues or candidates besides the presidency, that you really were watching in this race?
Guess I'll go. Yeah, the balance of the Michigan House stayed the same. That didn't change. But what did change, which was very important, was the Michigan Supreme Court flipped from 3 to 4 to 4 to 3, and that's important because of the redistricting that's going to happen and come up. So there could be some very important decisions that will be before the Michigan Supreme Court. So in our state, I would say that was perhaps the other than supporting Biden and Harris, I would say that was probably the biggest score for us.
I'll say for me, and it was something that that I've been talking about, and Paul touched on it earlier about the disconnect between rural and city urban centers, and that is the Medicaid expansion that went on through in places like Utah and Oklahoma, and so I think that is a way to bridge that gap because with rural hospitals closing, and I've been fortunate enough to work in various states, including the South and rural areas and cities. And that is one issue that I think we could bridge that gap over that culture issue, much like, if the building trades are building bridges and, and Amtrak trains for the next, 15, 20 years, it's going to help us. I think that will help us in rural America. And I also think it'll do something else that as well. And then I think it'll activate a lot of a lot more women in the labor movement as well, with the Medicaid expansion and paid family leave and those things. So I think that was the one thing in this election cycle that I was looking at. When Utah and Oklahoma expands Obamacare, it kind of makes you maybe look at it a little bit differently and say, man, that might be an issue that we can take up and start to bridge some of that rural and urban gap there that we're seeing, not just with labor, but just a DNR split in general.
Paul?
Yeah, I hate to ruin everybody's buzz. I've certainly had a buzz on the last 24 hours. But, there was a lot of disappointing news in the election results as well. And, we didn't make any progress here in Pennsylvania on the state legislature. A lot of races aren't quite clear yet, but we certainly didn't flip them or really even make much significant progress. And that happened in a lot of places around the country. And, that's really significant in terms of the redistricting that's going to go forward. And, we didn't get the Senate seats we hoped we had, which is going to limit some of the things that the Biden administration is going to do. Incidentally, though, Roland mentioned the Michigan State Supreme Court, which is one of the highlights. In Pennsylvania, we were able to get a majority of Democrats. We were able to flip the state Supreme Court, maybe 4 or 6 years ago. And I follow that very closely. And the labor movement in Pennsylvania gets a whole lot of credit for that. Those are races that people don't pay attention to and whatever. But the labor movement recognized how important they were in terms of things like redistricting, and sort of worked very hard to get that to flip the Supreme Court. We even saw it had an impact in this election because it was the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court that said that we could count ballots that come in up to 3 days after Election Day. That ruling is in effect now. The Trump administration is trying to get the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn that. But, a few tens of thousands of votes less that we had here, and that could have really made a big difference in the presidential election. There's still an awful lot of work to do because, we took a big step forward with Biden, but we didn't get the results that we'd hoped we would in a number of other areas.
For me, the one that I was really watching was Arizona passing an increase in their tax structure for the higher end earners. And it jumped significantly. It jumped 3.5% income tax increase on their top tier. And it was framed as a teachers issue. Teachers drove it. I think it came straight out of the Arizona teachers strike and the classrooms being underfunded and undersupported. And that additional tax base is going to teachers and going to classrooms. And it was a winner where here in Illinois, our progressive income tax lost hard. We have a flat tax and it lost hard, and we could do a whole show on why that was and how, the role of labor in that fight. But it was an interesting seeing a different state go a different way and how they framed restructuring their income tax and it seeing it passed. Well, listen, we've been talking for a long time, so I have one final question, but before I pose it, I wanted to give Gus or Bob, do you have any last minute questions that you want to ask, last thoughts?
Gus, would you mind if I, real quick, I'm not going to pose any.
Yeah, I have final thoughts at the very end, but they've answered all my questions, so I'm good.
Okay. Well, I was going to say essentially the same. I'm not going to throw any more questions in the mix. I do want to, though, however, note that I think this is the kinds of conversations about organized labor and the American political process and working men and women that needs to happen. And I'm proud of the fact that the labor education program could be a space and a venue for doing that. So I do want to thank all three of our guests for jumping in and raising some good questions and giving us some important things to consider, particularly this clash of culture versus class and which is dominant, which wins out. And I don't want you to try to answer this question here, but I'm going away thinking, well, if culture was dominant amongst more conservative building trades, and maybe, Paul, some of those steel workers in Pennsylvania, for example, or some of those auto workers in Roland's state, and certainly blue collar workers in Ohio, then how do we, when we think about teachers, Arizona, and we think about service sector and public sector workers who appear to have gone all in for Joe Biden, is it possible that they were all in for the Democrats because of cultural issues? That they saw certain Democratic stances on those cultural and social issues more important to them because maybe they're a more diverse union, there are more women, there are more people of color, there are more immigrants, and so they're not voting on class either. They're also voting cult, and maybe that's in my head, and I'm not going to sleep tonight because you all put it there. But I'm going to just leave it with that, and again, I'll allow you to ask your last question, Steph.
Bob, I think you framed it kind of, so you just basically summed up what your takeaway is, right? And what you're gonna be thinking about when you go to sleep. So for our three panelists, and this time we'll do it maybe in reverse order. So we'll start with Paul as the last state, and we'll go back down to Ohio. What's your takeaway for labor in this election? What's, as you reflect on this last week and this last year, and looking forward to January, what's your takeaway for labor in this election?
Paul, you're muted. Still muted.
Still muted. Yeah.
It reinforced in my mind a belief that I've long had. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania. I lived in West Virginia. I started out in the labor movement, worked a little while for the United Mine Workers Union. And I go back to a model of unionism back in West Virginia, of all places, if you can believe it, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where unions were an integral part of every person's life. And particularly those people who were union members, and there were lots of UMW members in West Virginia in the 60s and 70s, not so much anymore. And the union was an integral part of their life. People used to talk about the Holy Trinity, and that involved at least some combination of FDR, John Kennedy, but John L. Lewis was always one of the Holy Trinity. And now you look at West Virginia, and that's entirely changed. Unions are not a part of the culture of West Virginia anymore. But that culture was so strong back in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s that they were able to accomplish tremendous things. That's what we need to have. We need to build a culture among workers where unions are an integral part of that. Unfortunately, the rural working class culture right now in, well, let's say a place like Pennsylvania is, involves pickup trucks and country music and hunting. But how much different would it be if unions were part of that culture? One of those things that young kids learned as they grew up, the value of unions and why they need to be an important part of everybody's life. So that's what we have to move towards. And it's a daunting task. I think we're much closer, as you suggested, Stephanie, with urban workers, teachers, professional unions. Among those groups, I think unions are making a great deal of progress and have a more prominent role. But how do we get that back in the rural, industrial, blue-collar working class? A lot about what we talked about tonight has suggested a number of ways of doing that. But that's what I go away thinking is the real challenge for the American labor movement.
I guess I'm second. What seems to be what I hope is the case, and I think it will be the case, is that labor will have a seat at the table and have the ear of the Biden administration. They'll probably have a stronger seat at the table than they've had in quite some time with the Democratic Party. I would encourage the labor movement to work with the administration to come up with solid, concrete policy proposals that actually pass, that deal with the loss of gainful employment, protecting gainful employment. I think that the Democrats have to do something other than just preach neoliberalism, and the labor movement can help them craft policy for that. And the reason why this is important is in this election, I think that, we had high turnout, record turnout in some areas of the country. But it was turnout not because people, were attracted to Biden. It was because they were voting against Trump. And if in 4 years from now or 3 years from now, the Republicans are going to regroup. They're going to find someone not as noxious and awful as Trump. And, if we want to continue and grow, I think the Democratic Party has to show something tangible here. And the labor movement should be there to help them with that. That would be my advice.
I think everything that we've touched on today as should be part of the conversation moving forward. I think it's been great to connect with all of you and talk about all of these things. As I said earlier, I'm sitting in Nevada right now, and Paul, you said election turnout or results in Pennsylvania were not as you would like outside of the presidency. So I just want to see your Pennsylvania, and I raise you Ohio. We had our problems of our own, and I think I think just bridging the gap between that rural and urban is going to be the main fight there, that we've got to figure out how to communicate with it. And it's not going to be messages like not standing up for the anthem. That's not going to win us rural votes. It won't win us rural union members. Defunding the police messaging won't win us rural members. It will not win us rural union votes. And so I think we've got to really focus in on those issues that are going to be affecting labor themselves. And I think maybe Medicaid expansion is one of the ways to get there, to look at it. But really looking at those issues, I think, are going to be the biggest thing. I'm going to also say something else probably that's not going to be popular among some people, but I don't think 2022 and 2024 are going to go the way that the Democrats are hoping it's going to go. I see some bad writing on the wall coming, and we've got to make some quick direction changes if we want to have a more victorious night, especially down ballot. So I'm not convinced that 2022 and 2024 are going to be, partying and champagne like many of us were, I guess, just yesterday. So, so I think that's my main takeaway, is that we've still got a lot of work to do, and 2022 is not far off. There's already people raising money for those races. So I think we need to really buckle down and start figuring out how we connect that rural and urban divide.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists. I just really appreciate you coming on and talking about these issues. I think this is by far the most Facebook comments and questions that we've ever gotten on one of these panels. I tried to at least bring some of them in and help them shape the conversation, but we had a lot of comments on Facebook. So thank you for that. Gus, any last thoughts?
Yeah, just to say, I think that all of you added something that is incredibly crucial to any type of progressive change that we want in the labor movement. And I think that, I think that's kind of what we have to do. We have to have uncomfortable conversations and actually talk about where can the interests of groups that are feeling the brunt of the problems of the political economy, where can they meet at? They can meet at something related to Medicare, Medicaid. They can meet at certain things that are related to the things that are affecting us in the political economy. And so I think that a lot of the strategy has to be involved in not only the Biden and the Congress listening to the rank and file workers, but we have to hold them accountable. And we have to, like I think Roland said it, or either Paul, one of you said it best, in that we have to be at the table crafting legislation so that stuff is written in our words. So we're having decision-making control over what our lives will look like. And I think that is so crucial to anything happening in terms of us not doing what David said and taking steps back. Because the minute we become involved in our own futures, the minute we become more invested, the minute we're going to continue to stay consistently invested. And so we got to find out where all of our interests can coincide. And the ones that can't coincide, then unfortunately, we're going to always struggle over those, because as somebody mentioned earlier, we are in new times and there are new voices out there and new issues. But you all are I just really love this panel. I think you all did an amazing job. People are going to leave here today with a lot of things to discuss and actually raise more questions. So not just to stop and celebrate or stop and do whatever, but to actually discuss and start doing some investigating. That's what we always want to get across from this as a political education tool. So I just want to thank all three of you for coming out and doing this today with us.
Thank you. Thank you all. We went a little bit longer than we usually go on these, but thank you. It was a good conversation, and we probably could have talked for another few hours, but thank you for giving us the updates, both from your states and also from your perspectives, and doing this for a while. So very much appreciated. And y'all have a good afternoon or evening.
Thank you,
guys.
everyone.
Good evening.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Good night. Bye-bye. Be well.
Bye-bye.